Welcome to Blue Collar Reformation. PBR here again with Freak Month, and really the end of Freak Month and a roundup of the subjects that we've gone over. I really couldn't cover everything that you could possibly imagine with regard to just insane ideas and insane theologies that are out there. We went over the Book of Enoch. We went over some of the bad ideas from evangelical feminism, and I mean, left so many stones unturned like that we could really go over this month. But really, what I wanted to do today is kind of explain the reason why the belief in the paranormal or ideas about feminism or Hegelianism or Marxism come into the life of the church and theology because they're part of the wider culture, and how there is basically an impulse from the kind of growth of modern thinking that affects the church and bad ideas coming into the church. So really, it's a matter of how the world has put pressure on us, how we think and how we speak, and we're not aware of the wider culture. And we need to be, because what it's doing is it's making us not necessarily you or not necessarily me, but it's making us as Christians entertain some really bad ideas. And so the way I want to do this is basically by going over some of the history of where thought has gone since really the Middle Ages to now, and how things have changed, so that we can explain why there is basically this God of the gaps paranormal thinking, or unsustainable, nonsensical, really psychotic thinking that goes into a lot of the theologies and beliefs that people have today. Why is it that somebody can believe so dogmatically in something that is so nonsensical, like the things we've covered over the course of time in Freak Month, and without evidence, without empirical, anything to be able to point toward, let alone biblical standards as to why the thesis would be true? And why would somebody hold that and say that it's true, say that it's a theological standpoint that he or she holds to, without that kind of backing? Well, it all makes sense if you look at the history of thought. So in the Middle Ages, basically the question was, what is God? What is ultimate reality? And of course, when you're talking about ultimate reality in the Middle Ages, it really is the one question of who is the triune God, the Christian God. There are other views that are out there in the Western world, but for the most part, in the medieval world, the question is, what is God? Because God is ultimate reality. Things are what they are, and God is God. The triune God is true, and we all know that. And so it's a matter of figuring out who he is and learning more about him. So you have debates between the East and the West about the nature of the Trinity. You have the split in 1054 with regard to the filioque clause, because it's a distinction between the Eastern and Western view of the triune God. Now, that shows us basically where the conversation lies. It's a matter of what is ultimate reality, who is God. But what happens in the modern period is that there's a rise of thinking about still ultimate reality, but not necessarily the triune God. Instead, what it ends up happening is more of what's called a natural theology, that there's a theology, a doctrine of God that comes through pure reason and pure thinking about the world that is. So sort of taking the Romans 1 approach to God, who has shown himself to exist through the things that have been made, that turns into a natural theology. And so what ends up happening is you get people who are trying to explain the universe from pure reason, or even then later on, a critique of pure reason. So what you get is like Rene Descartes, who says, I think, therefore I am. That is, that the basis of his belief that he does exist and that the world exists is because he thinks. To think is to be something, not to be nothing. And therefore he must at least exist. And then he builds everything off of that foundation of that he exists because he thinks. So then eventually what ends up happening is that there's this worldview of pure reason. What Immanuel Kant comes along to do is critique that pure reason and say that there's a divide between what we see phenomenologically, like there's phenomenon, and then there's the noumena, which is outside of this world, that is beyond, into the world of pure reason. But we actually don't know the transcendent God of the noumenal world. And so Kant basically says, because we can't know that, what we have to do is we have to look at the phenomenon. Well, this eventually leads modern thought away from considering um, basically what is ultimate reality, because it can't be accessed anyway, because it's infinite and it's distinct from us. It's so transcendent, we can't ever approach it. And so the result is that people start looking at, okay, what is happening in the world? How has God revealed himself through the things that have been made? And so they go to a what's called a dynamic view of reality instead of looking at ultimate reality. There's a belief of basically a panentheism, that all things, God is in all things. And this is called is process theology. And it's basically where you have God working himself out like a sewage treatment plant in the universe. And so this is the way that the postmodern world really looks at God. This is how Marxists look at God. Really, the best analogy for it that Jürgen Moltmann, a process theologian, talks about is basically a sewage treatment plant. God is working himself out, purifying himself and the universe through a process of progress and growth over time. Well, so what ends up happening, here's where this thing comes together. What ends up happening is that uh, the natural theology gave way, and you have this critique of pure reason that eventually becomes focused on what we know is only that which we see. And then it ends up becoming basically a complete atheism, because really you have a problem of not being able to climb up into the life and mind of God, because all of life kind of ends at the top of humanity. Humanity is the top of the evolutionary scale. And therefore, the result is that you can't rise above that with any kind of chain of being. You can't know what's ahead of that. There's no ability to empirically give any information to ourselves or find out any information, because there's just that limit. There's that ceiling. So basically, it works like this. Gerald Bray, in his book, The Doctrine of God, points this out. As there is no evolution from human beings to God, the evolutionary scale stops with the human race, since no other form of life is available for scientific investigation, and natural theology is left without viable support. So what ends up happening is that the world falls into basically an empirical way of thinking, but then that has problems too, which leads to the paranormal. And this is what Gerald Bray talks about. And this is really something that resonates very deeply with me, because I think that this is where paranormal thinking comes in, is basically a God of the gaps for where the world can't make sense of a world without the triune God. You can't account for it. So he says one result of this commitment to science can be seen in the widespread urge today to examine what is tellingly called the paranormal. The word is interesting in itself because it reveals a fundamental belief in a scientific norm. The study of the paranormal has, in fact, never received universal approval in scientific circles, being most staunchly opposed by those who believe that scientific method is the key to all truth. In spite of this, there is now a greater openness to the paranormal. So here's why. He points out there's a greater openness to the paranormal, partly because scientific experiments have revealed complexities in the universe which were previously undreamt of, but partly also because confidence in the power of science was to resolve every problem has waned considerably. What was once supposed to herald an age of progress for humanity, free from fears rooted in superstition, has turned out instead to be a hidden monster which dangles in front of us a fiery destruction infinitely more terrible than any medieval picture of hell. The modern world once hailed as a liberator the force which now threatens to destroy it, a terrible paradox which has driven many people to look elsewhere for meaning in their lives. So basically, to a God of the gaps, basically to the paranormal. Because if the scientific method can't look above us, can't basically get to God, can't account for the world that there is, there must be something else. And this is why I covered aliens this month. This is why I covered all of these things, is because basically these are God of the gaps kind of things that the modern world has to basically presuppose. Otherwise, they can't make sense of the world. So the end result of modernism is a God of the gaps paranormal belief where people are trying to find meaning and the answers to all things in the universe. The answer is they need to scratch deeper beneath the surface of these things and recognize God is there and he has spoken in his son. This is PBR signing off. Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.